The train station was deserted. The dim, flickering lights barely illuminated the cracked tiles and rusting benches. It was as if the place had been forgotten by time itself. Mia stood alone on the platform, clutching her ticket tightly. The air was thick with fog, and the only sound was the distant hoot of an approaching train. She glanced down at her ticket. It felt odd in her hand, heavier than a normal slip of paper. The text was faded and barely legible, but she could just make out the words, Midnight Express, destination, unknown. Mia frowned. She didn't remember buying this ticket, but here she was, waiting for a train she couldn't explain. It was as if something, or someone, had drawn her to this station. Her watch showed 11:59 p.m. The distant rumbling grew louder. The fog thickened, swirling in strange patterns as the train came into view. It wasn't like any train she'd ever seen. The cars were sleek yet archaic, their blackened surfaces glinting faintly under the station lights. The windows were opaque, hiding whatever might be inside. The train screeched to a halt, and a blast of icy air swept over the platform. The doors slid open with a low hiss, revealing nothing but pitch darkness inside. No conductor, no passengers, no sound. Mia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn around and leave. But her feet moved on their own, stepping forward. She couldn't explain it. Something about the train called to her, a pull she couldn't resist. As she boarded, the doors closed behind her with a final, metallic clang. The train jerked into motion almost immediately, and Mia stumbled, catching herself on a cold, steel pole. The interior was dimly lit, the seats old and covered in dust. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The further she moved, the darker it became. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She chose a seat near the window and sat down, staring out into the foggy night. The world outside was unfamiliar. No towns, no roads, just endless black trees that seemed to bend and twist as the train sped past. Her unease grew with each passing second. Something about the train wasn't right. It felt alive, as if it were watching her. She pulled out her phone to check for a signal, but the screen was blank. No apps, no time, just a single line of text. "Do not leave your seat." Mia's breath hitched. Her pulse quickened, and then she felt it, a presence. Someone, or something, was watching her. Mia's eyes darted around the dimly lit train car, but she saw nothing out of the ordinary. The seats were empty, the air stale, but the feeling of being watched, it was undeniable. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest, and her palms grew clammy. She leaned forward, glancing down the darkened aisle, her breath catching in her throat. A shadow moved, just a flicker, barely visible at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, but the train car was still, empty, silent. "Get a grip, Mia," she whispered to herself. She tried to steady her breath, to tell herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks in the oppressive darkness. But the feeling didn't fade. The air grew colder. Mia pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't help. The chill seeped into her skin, leaving a lingering, unnatural coldness in the air. The train car felt smaller now, as if it were slowly closing in on her. She glanced out the window again, desperate for any sign of civilization, but the fog was thick and impenetrable. The trees outside had become twisted, their gnarled branches reaching like clawed hands, grasping at the train. Suddenly, the lights flickered above her, then went out completely. The car plunged into darkness. Mia's breath caught in her throat, and she gripped the edge of her seat, her eyes straining to see anything, but it was like she was blind. Click. A sound, sharp and clear, came from the far end of the train car. Mia froze, her body tensing, every nerve in her body screaming to move. Another click, this time closer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned her head slowly, her eyes desperately searching the dark for any sign of what was approaching. Then, a whisper, a low, gravelly voice from the shadows. "Don't look at them." Mia's skin crawled. The voice wasn't clear, but it was there, brushing against her ear, like the words were being spoken directly inside her head. The footsteps grew louder, heavier. There was something out there. The train began to slow, and Mia's stomach twisted in fear. The screeching of the brakes pierced the silence, but it wasn't the sound of the train stopping that made her panic. It was the fact that the car wasn't coming to a complete halt. The motion continued, sluggish, as though the train was inching forward without control. Mia looked out the window, and the landscape had changed. The trees were gone. The fog was gone. In their place was a vast, endless void, blackness stretching into eternity. Her throat tightened, the air in the train car growing stifling. There was no station, no stop, only the endless black, closing in on them, swallowing the train whole. The footsteps stopped. Mia felt a weight settle in the air, like something heavy was moving toward her, just beyond the reach of her sight. "Get off the train," the voice rasped, now just a breath, almost a plea. Mia's hand gripped the armrest, her fingers cold and shaking. Should she listen? Should she run? Her body screamed at her to move, to escape before it was too late. But the weight of the words hung in the air. Get off the train. And then, in the dim light, a figure appeared before her. The figure emerged from the shadows like a wisp of smoke, its outline barely visible in the suffocating darkness. Mia's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen with fear. She could see only vague shapes at first, but as the figure stepped closer, the details became clearer. It was tall, impossibly tall, with thin limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a blur of features, like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. Its skin was ashen gray, and its eyes, those eyes, were wide and hollow, black as the void outside the train. Mia's pulse thundered in her ears as the figure moved toward her, its steps slow but deliberate. Every movement felt wrong, as if it weren't entirely part of this world. The air around it seemed to warp, the space stretching and bending as it drew closer. The voice, now clearer, rasped from the figure's mouth. "You shouldn't have gotten on. You're not supposed to be here." Mia wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The train had slowed to a crawl, the screech of its wheels now a constant, grinding noise. The darkness outside had become an impenetrable wall, and there was no way out. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its gaze locked onto her. She could feel its presence in every bone of her body, an oppressive weight that crushed her chest and stole her breath. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was dry, tight, as though the air itself had thickened and filled her lungs. "You're on the last train," the figure said, its voice low and chilling. "There is no destination. There is only the journey." Mia's mind raced. The last train? Was she dead? Was this some kind of purgatory? She couldn't understand, couldn't process the reality of what was happening. She tried to stand, but her legs were like jelly, her knees buckling beneath her. The figure seemed to notice her struggle and leaned forward, its face inches from hers. Its breath was cold, like the dead wind that swept through abandoned tombs. "Once you board, you can never leave," it whispered. "You will ride until the end of time." Suddenly, a deep rumbling sound reverberated through the train, shaking the floor beneath Mia. The train began to pick up speed again, faster and faster, until it felt as though the walls were closing in on her. The lights flickered violently, casting the car in a frantic, erratic strobe. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the chaos, But when she opened them again, the figure had vanished. The train, however, was still speeding into the darkness, and Mia was no longer alone. Across the aisle, a new figure had appeared. A man, seated calmly, his hands resting on his lap. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But Mia felt his presence, like a cold wind pressing against her skin. Are you real?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. The man slowly lifted his head, and in the dim light, Mia saw his face. He was smiling, a thin, twisted smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're not the first," he said, his voice hollow and distant, "and you won't be the last." His words sank into her chest like lead, the weight of them pressing down on her. Mia's mind screamed for answers, but she felt herself slipping, as though the train was pulling her further into some other realm, a place where time didn't matter and reality bent with each passing mile. The man's smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the half-light. And then he spoke again, his voice now a soft, echoing whisper that seemed to surround her from all sides. "Everyone who gets on stays." Mia's heart raced as the man's chilling words echoed in her mind. "Everyone who gets on stays." The weight of his smile, that twisted grin, lingered in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating her thoughts. She backed away from him slowly, her legs trembling. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run. But the train seemed to mock her, its walls closing in, the flickering lights making it impossible to find a clear escape. The man's smile never faltered. He simply watched her, unmoving. His eyes, still glowing faintly in the dark, felt as though they were drilling into her soul. Mia's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands gripping the edge of the seat to steady herself. "Where are we going?" Mia finally found her voice, though it sounded foreign, weak. "What is this place?" The man's smile widened. "You already know, don't you?" His voice was soft, almost coaxing, as if he were speaking to a child. "This train doesn't go anywhere, not in the way you think. It only goes where the lost go." "Lost?" Mia whispered, her mind spinning. Was she dead? Was this some twisted afterlife? She couldn't make sense of it, but she knew one thing for sure. She didn't belong here. The train lurched again, its speed picking up once more. Mia's grip tightened on the seat, her knuckles white. The darkness outside the windows had become thick, oppressive, like the train was traveling through a void that stretched on endlessly. There was no end, no destination, only more darkness. The man leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "You'll learn soon enough. Everyone does." Mia's stomach churned. There was something wrong with him, something unnatural. Her eyes darted around the car, but the walls seemed to be closing in tighter now. The air felt thicker, as if it were charged with electricity, and she could almost hear a faint hum beneath the noise of the train. Suddenly, the lights flickered once more, this time plunging the train into complete darkness. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the distant clattering of the train's wheels. Mia's pulse thundered in her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that the lights would return, praying that this nightmare would end. When the lights came back, everything had changed. The car was no longer empty. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she saw the other passengers, sitting silently in the seats, their faces gaunt, their eyes lifeless. Some were staring straight ahead, others with their heads tilted at strange angles, as though their necks had been broken. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to notice Mia at all.